Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this event about the humanitarian crisis of Venezuelan migrants and refugees and the temporary status of migrant protections. My name is Jose Ignacio Hernandez, and it is a pleasure on behalf of the Growth Lab to welcome you. And I will introduce the moderator of this event, David Smolaski, who is the commissioner of the Organization of American States for the crisis of Venezuelan migrants and refugees. David, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jose Ignacio, and thank you, the Harvard Growth Lab, for organizing this very important seminar about the humanitarian crisis of Venezuelan migrants and refugees and the temporary status of migrant protections. Venezuelan refugee crisis is the largest in the history of the region and projects to be the largest in the world, surpassing Syria. At the moment of this conference, 5.5 million Venezuelans have fled their country because of shortages of food, shortages of medicine, human rights violation, crimes against humanity, general violence, lack of services, and the collapse of the economy. This unprecedented outflow has created so many challenges in the region, from Colombia with 1.7 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees, to Peru with 1 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees, to Mexico with more than 100,000, to the US with more than 400,000. But apart from the challenges, it has created plenty of opportunities for the receiving countries. So to discuss these challenges and these opportunities, it's an honor for me to moderate this great panel with experts from different areas that during the last years on the roles have been addressing this refugee crisis. With us will be today Lala Lovera, which is the founder of the NGO Comparte Una Vida, and she has been working in Colombia for more than 15 years. Betilde Muñoz, a colleague from the Organization of American States. She's the director of the Department of Social Inclusion at the OES. It's an honor for me to present her. Ana María Ibáñez, economics principal advisor of the Inter-American Development Bank, and Mr. Dani Bahar, who is a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution and associated at the Growth Lab. Thank you all for being here and for making the time on your busy agenda to have this seminar. And thanks, Jose Ignacio, also for making this possible. Jose Ignacio Hernandez, who is a fellow at the Growth Lab and professor at the Universidad Católica, Andrés Bello, of course, will be with us during the whole seminar today. So with that, I'll give the floor to Lala Lovera. Every speaker will have 10 minutes. Please be respectful on time. And after everyone has their 10 minutes, we will have a discussion for 30 minutes where we're going to answer some questions from the audience and also questions that I'm also be preparing after the presentation of the panel. So with that, I give the floor to Lala. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Jose, for inviting me to this wonderful space, which for us, raising the voice and being the voice of all those migrants that we have been working since 2018 in Colombia. It's a wonderful work. So as David said, I'm leading a team that we are working on the field on the first, it's like in the border with Venezuela and Colombia, and well, all over Colombia, but I'm going to focus today about this migration, which right now, 2021, I think it's important for us to have like we call it the X-ray of this migration. I think it's important. So I am the executive director of Comparte por una Vida Colombia, and I'm going to present a very infographic, let me put it here. So everybody can see it. Can you confirm that? Yes? Great. So we all know that there's almost 2.5 million migrants in Colombia right now. These are the official numbers, okay? But today I wanna present, I wanna talk about the pendular migration, which is not a new migration. We can say it's the oldest one. It's like typical migration. It's the typical conduct of this border. And now we have, today we can say we have 365 days of a border closed, but it's only a border, okay? Just 7 bridges are closed because we know, because we work in the field, we are just I like to call it like the ground zero of this migration crisis, that the border is not closed. So right now, as we speak, almost 7,000, between 7,000 and 8,000 people are crossing that border through the irregular crossing points, which are called trochas, okay? Those trochas, as you can see here, are all controlled by the irregular groups, illegal groups, which are constant violating the rights and fundamental rights of these people, okay? They are escaping. We all know the reason. They are hunger. They are looking for some, for health and attention. So we need to understand this, that we think, and there's, that the border is closed, but the border is not closed. That's not a reality when you go to the border and you see what's happening. So this 7,000, between 7,000 and 8,000 people crossing the border, 80% go back and forth every day, 80%, okay? And 20% are on transit. They're going back also to, they're going to Peru, or they're going to stay in Colombia and everything. But the worst part of this is 65% are children alone, most of them, okay? So this increases all the vulnerabilities and all the violations, and their rights are not covered, okay? So we in the field, as we were telling you, we have 3 years working with this pendular migration, and we find out that 42% of these children are in malnourishment. They only have less than $1 to feed themselves when they cross the border. So the situation won't change in which side of where they are. If they are in Venezuela, they cross the border to find some food, but they won't find some food. And 70% of these people are irregular. They don't have access to any document, okay? Not in Venezuela and not in Colombia. This is a very important thing. They don't have a passport, or if they have, they will be robbed. Most of them get robbed to get the passports or the paper that will explain who they are. So we don't know who these people are, okay? Also, how they are living in this pendular situation. 65% of the migrants they don't have a fixed income. They work for informality, okay? So when the pandemic arrived and there was a call to stay at home and a quarantine, this is totally impossible for these people, okay? Because they need to go to the streets because they work in an informal, the only income comes from the informal work, okay? So that this raises again their fundamental rights, there raises again the exposure to all the violence that are receiving them in the country, in Colombia. And this is something that we are working in our team, and we're having this think tank about who's receiving this pendular migration, who are receiving them, and who are getting the routes for them for attention. Those are the irregular groups of Colombia and Venezuela. We have been seeing what's happening in Arauca. Who's the front in the river in this irregular path receiving these children, okay? Also, 35% of them, they only have one smartphone and they don't have any connections. So the first fundamental right of education, they are not covering that. Most of them are crossing the border to get education and to get to school, but this is impossible for them. And also, again, who's raising their voice in these children? These children are youngsters, head of their family households. We have to understand this. These are children that they need to go to the streets to get the household of their whole family. And we're talking about families, 5 persons per family, but they host between 12 and 18 persons in the same room. This is the way this pendular migration lives, okay? And they only have one smartphone. Also, 40% of these families, they don't have access to permanent energy or to safe water. So when they face COVID, just imagine not having water. So it's terrible. And we're talking about all this information is in the Colombian side, okay? They're looking for this. They cross the border irregular way, in an informal way, with no organization, and they find this, okay? Also in education, I think it's one of the what we're trying to see what is going to happen. And I think these kind of spaces, it's the proper spaces to raise this voice. These children, since 2018, have been going to schools in Colombia, but if they are irregular and they don't have any document, they won't get the diploma or a letter that says that they graduate. If they don't have that, they won't have access to higher education, to formal, some formal education, or not even a formal job. I know that we're waiting for this new document for Colombia, but how these people are going to reach for that if they are in Venezuelan side? They don't live in Colombia, they're pendular. And we are talking about 70% of the migration, okay? So this is something that really are raising our alarms. We can't start promoting education if they won't get the final step that is going to continue for at least a formal job, because we're going to continue in the circle of this, of the 70% that are irregular, and irregular groups are going to continue raising their voice on a higher way. The only way these children and these youngsters that, as I told you, I think that the drama is this: they are head of the family households. This is a reality. We can't change that. So we need to see what is going to happen. And also the access to education sometimes it's so frustrating, because these are children that has been for 2 or 3 years, they drop out from school. So they are unschooled. So accessing to a system that they don't know, it's totally a fantasy. So we're trying to get these safe spaces for them in order not only to assist to school, but to stay in school, okay? About health, well, we all know that this is one of the biggest issues here in Colombia, addressing health to the irregular migration and the pendular, which are, I think that 60% or 70% of people cross the border in order to find some treatment, because they have chronic disease, they have pre-existing diseases. So I think this is important. Also, 90% of these migrants, pendular migrants, they don't have access to healthcare services, only in an emergency. But when COVID arrived, so the emergency, it's only COVID, of course. In mental health issues, we also see that they are a constant victim. Okay, they are not a victim. They just cross the border and now they start to work in their mental health situation. No, this pendular migration, they are constant victims of Venezuela, of Colombia, of the border, of the crossing, and not receiving them in the proper way and not having the route for them. Of course, their mental health, it's totally devastated. So 62.5% of these families experience anger, frustration, violence, and that, because we have to understand, they live on a violent situation. They live on a violence environment. So they are part of that. And the worst part that we see in our work in the field is that they normalize this violence, and we can't normalize the violence. This is not normal. Being part of irregular groups is not normal. Being part of the system of the migrant trafficking is not normal. We can't normalize that. And we're working that with our youngsters, but it's so hard if we don't have a second card to say, okay, don't do that, come here. And in face of COVID, I think 23% of our families, or the families in Norte de Santander specifically, they were infected by COVID, but only 10% were diagnosed by doctors. Most of them were like, well, I think, I thought, I feel, but it wasn't, and they didn't get treatment, okay? And they crossed the border again in order to find some treatment, in order to find and cover this. So what we want to drop in the table today is that we have seen a lot of cooperation, of course, in the field. We see a lot of people working in the field. We see a national government getting some actions, but we can't ignore the typical conduct of this border, which was the pendular migration. All the actions that we have seen and we are seeing, they won't address these people. They won't address the pendular migration. And we need to do this because this is the part that are in continue, as I said, violating their human rights. These are the people that won't that will not get stabilization. They won't get access. They don't know how to get access. So in my opinion, and in our opinion, we need to understand how to receive these people in this side, because this is a reality that won't change in a long-term time. So I think that's all my presentation. I got my 10 minutes, no?
You got your 10 minutes. Very good, Lala. Thank you so much for sharing that very interesting slide on your presentation. And so next will be with us Betilde Munoz, as I said, the director of the Department of Social Inclusion at the Organization of American States. Betilde, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David, for the introduction, for moderating the discussion, but also thank you for your leadership in shedding light on the situation of millions of Venezuelans, both in the country and outside the country. So thanks so much. And also thanks to Professor Jose Ignacio Hernandez. Jose, thank you so much for provoking this discussion that will continue to be relevant as long as the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela is not resolved. So for my 10 minutes to kind of jumpstart the discussion, I wanted to focus on three big areas that perhaps could, that definitely are relevant, but we may be able to address them in the Q&A period. Firstly, I wanted to just briefly reflect on the regularization, or the importance of regularization for migrants and refugees from the angle of vulnerable populations, and how strategic it is for their inclusion. I think Lala has just really put in human terms the importance of bringing these rights to these populations, and of course also the limits of regularization processes in the region that we're seeing progress, but of course there's some limits to that. Secondly, very briefly on xenophobia and discrimination and the challenges that remain, and I think that's very relevant for this discussion. And finally, I will be very brief, but I wanted to also put light on the particular situation of migrant Venezuelan women, and at least some ideas of why they have to be they have to be at the center of interventions to address the humanitarian crisis within Venezuela, but also outside. On the first issue of regularization, I always say, those of you who are here and have heard me before, I always say that regularization is the door for Venezuelan migrants and refugees, and from any nationality really, for that matter, and it's the mandate that I have at the OAS, to have full access to other rights, and for countries to really start that integration process that Lala was referring to. In other words, although it is not all, it is actually only the first step, regularization is very important when it comes to guaranteeing protection to displaced Venezuelans. Now, where are we in the region? I mean, if we were to take a broad look at the region in terms of regularization, and how does this impact the lives of displaced Venezuelans. I definitely want to mention, and this is a topic also, the title of the event that is bringing us together today, measures such as the temporary protection status approved in Colombia. We do not talk much about it, but also the complementary protection option or measure that was approved in Costa Rica, which protects Venezuelans as well as Nicaraguans and Cubans in that country. The TPS that was approved in the US on March 8th. All of these measures are raising the bar in terms of protection standards for displaced populations. Of course, we can continue progressing to more protections and higher standards, but these are what I believe we see a positive evolution in protection and regularization measures to receive these populations. And it is positive, it's actually very positive, because they're happening despite existing regulatory frameworks that may not have these options. So, these are responses, pragmatic responses that we're seeing on the part of countries in the region. And they're also happening despite economic restrictions, because all of these measures really have a cost for the national budgets of the countries that are receiving them. And they're still being approved regardless of these economic restrictions that were really aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So perhaps my main point, or my first reflection on this point, is that if these temporary protection exercises work well, I would think that we would be moving at the regional level towards a new wave of immigration regularization measures that are characterized by high levels of humanitarian solidarity, a high degree of innovation, really, comparatively speaking to other regions in the world, and that will make it possible to take more advantage of the arrival of these populations. So, which takes me to the second point on how these regularization measures impact the lives of people, of Venezuelans in these receiving countries. I always say that, when these measures are approved and implemented the right way, it's a win-win. It's a win-win situation, no? The country that receives migrants and refugees wins because it allows them to know and characterize and identify the population that is in the country, and then hopefully inform better or more effective design of public policies to respond to their arrivals. And the displaced population also wins because they're able to access a regular status. And hopefully many other rights that they would not necessarily have access to if they were in the country in irregularity, or irregularly. So, if we were to think of concrete manifestations, I think Lala illustrated very well what happens when we maintain these populations in irregular status, and the possibility of them sitting in a classroom, kids, for instance, migrant kids sitting in a classroom, and when they complete their course of study, receiving a letter that says that they completed this education and they can now access a university education or get a formal employment. These are concrete ways that regularization processes help. But in terms of the adult population, both men and women, we also see that regularization is the first step for them to be able to insert themselves in the formal economy. And Dani is here with us, as well as Ana Maria. They can reflect more on this. But in terms of from a human rights perspective, it also means that their rights will be protected, that they will not necessarily be subject to harassment, labor harassment, in the case of women, sexual harassment in the workplaces, and a series of other benefits that start with that first step, which is regularization, health, access to medicines, so paying Social Security, and of course the country that receives them also benefits in terms of them contributing with taxes and the Social Security and all of this. Now, in terms of challenges or limits of these regularization processes, I wanted to map out a few just to get us going in the conversation. The first one is the existence of some requirements so that people can access these documents or these benefits, the migratory benefits. And for instance, in the case of Colombia, the requirement for them to have an ID, a formal and valid ID, and having had access the country via formal passings, when we know that Lala explained, 70%, 60, 70% of these populations are in irregular situation. A second one it has to be on how best to rule out people with criminal records or that are linked to criminal networks and so on from accessing the status. This issue of criminality is part of the political conversation and tends to justify xenophobic reactions against Venezuelans. So we have to see how to help countries granting these regularization options to eliminate it from xenophobic arguments from more political conversations. A third one that I would also map out is the temporary nature of these measures. I mean, they have the the temporary in their own definition. Those who all of us who study and try to understand migratory processes find that this temporary nature is the Achilles heel of these responses that are happening, in the sense that they may change as governments change. So I always say also that part of the conversation has to be how to ensure that these temporary measures are institutionalized somehow in the migratory law, or that there's some protections or candados, that could be incorporated in the sense that they can be secure even though there's changes in administration. And a final challenge is what I call el mito del problema resuelto, the myth of the problem solved. Okay, we did a regularization measure, is problem solved, and it's not really like that. It's this idea that all is needed to ensure the protection and integration of Venezuelans is just grant them a regularization status. I just want to warn, or a word of caution on this, because the real integration will occur when displaced Venezuelans can have dignified housing, as Lala was explaining, access to services, access to water, health, and kids go to school and can eventually join universities or the formal market and the like. So that on the issue of regularization options. On xenophobia and discrimination, we cannot deny that the Venezuelans are being victims of xenophobia and discrimination throughout the region, and much more with a pandemic that made resources more scarce. And these of course there's cultural explanations on the rejection of the foreigner, but I think for the region there's a lot of the arguments are probably economic. In the sense that the locals may feel that they are being displaced by the newcomers, but of course there's data that confirms this, in the sense that although they come in very vulnerable material conditions, Venezuelans are bringing important human capital to the countries of destination. So there's this fear of the locals that will be displaced. I mean, we know that 35% of the Venezuelan population in Peru have a technical degree or higher, a figure that increases to 40% in the case of Ecuador. In the case of Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Costa Rica, more than 50% of Venezuelan migrants have a university degree, and sometimes even a postgraduate degree. So, you can understand why there may be some resistance to their inclusion. But the good thing is, when we can talk about more later, is that there's policy responses that can come from the receiving countries in terms of capitalizing on this human talent, but also reducing this resistance on the part of the locals. And of course, from the point of view of the work we do at the OAS, crucial to this is ensuring that opportunities are given, not just to the displaced populations, but also to the locals in the communities that are receiving them. I think I have more to say on this, but I will leave it at that so that I can just briefly close on the issue of Venezuelan migrant women. This is something that I think we all need to keep paying attention. We cannot lose sight of the particular reality of migration that Venezuelan women and their children are experiencing. Lala illustrated the case of the women at the border, but this is something that we are seeing in all the way down to Argentina. We're seeing also in the countries of the Caribbean. And we see that at least recent trends before the pandemic were showing what we're calling a feminization of the migration, of Venezuelan migration, in the sense that women were and continue to migrate in similar levels as men. Recent anecdotal accounts on the part of Colombian authorities are telling us that there's a lot of migrant women walking with other women, and a lot of children, not just theirs, but the women, the children of other women that they're bringing and reuniting with their mothers. So this is something that may end up being another point of crisis another point in the bigger or the macro level crisis of Venezuelan migration, and this is something that we need to pay attention to. We had instances of employer abuse on the part of migrant Venezuelan women at the beginning of the year. We have data from CEPAS, an NGO in Venezuela that collects data on feminicides that is showing increases in the level of gender violence against migrant women, and that have even end up in the death of these women. So the call is always to make women visible, not just in terms of the ways they are particularly affected by the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and outside of Venezuela, but also how to ensure that women can be part of the solutions because they have things to contribute based on their own experience. I will leave it at that, David. Thanks again, and ready for the discussion after.
Thank you, Betilde. Now, the floor is for Ana Maria Ibanez, as I said, Economics Principal Advisor of the Inter-American Development Bank. Ana Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much, Jose, and the Harvard Growth Lab for inviting me for this conference. I hope you're seeing already the presentation. I am really very pleased to be sharing this important conversation with such a great panel. And my presentation today will concentrate on preliminary results of a paper that we're doing with several colleagues from the IDB, the Universidad de los Andes, and the University of Southern California. And it's really a very good follow-up from Betilde Muñoz's presentation, which is great because she was talking about regularization. And what we want to do precisely is to study the impacts of a regularization program, a large regularization program that happened in Colombia in 2018. So, as I say, Betilde did a very good and very thorough discussion on regularization programs and what happens with regularization programs. But the adoption of these programs is not frequent. It happens only in some countries. But it might be a very important policy to integrate migrants into societies. And also, and I would like to stress that, for countries to reap the benefits of migrants. I mean, migrants can bring a lot of benefits for development, and they integrate, and these regularization programs may contribute to that. However, there is really high fears of a political backlash in many countries and lack of evidence of the impact of these programs for countries. And this often leads to policymakers to avoid this discussion or to avoid approving regularization programs. The main argument being to protect, as Betilde says, the local vulnerable population, for example, with more competition on labor markets, and prevent an overflow on the demand for social services in countries which already are facing tight fiscal demands. Nonetheless, the evidence on the effect of these programs is really quite limited. And most of it concentrates on developed countries and on the impacts for the locals and not necessarily for the migrants. So the paper that I'm going to present today, and I'm just going to give you a very brief snapshot of what we're doing, and this is the first time that we present it, is to estimate the effects of this massive regularization program that happened in Colombia in 2008. And we want to estimate the impacts on the Venezuelans that were beneficiaries of the program. We analyze 4 dimensions: welfare, employment and labor conditions, integration, and health. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to concentrate on welfare, employment, and labor conditions, and just on some aspects of that. What I anticipate is that the effects are large and are important. Let me talk briefly about the program, because this is important. This is a program that was implemented in 2018, and the program did not start as a regularization process. Really, it started as a census that the Colombian government wanted to do to irregular migrants, and the purpose was to have a characterization, a socioeconomic characterization of these irregular migrants. The census started in 441 municipalities across Colombia, and the government tried to do a huge information campaign so that migrants registered in this Registro Administrativo de Migrantes Venezolanos. The time span was between April and June of 2018. Not all irregular migrants registered. There were fears of deportation and other types of fears, and about 442,000 individuals registered, which amounts to around 253,000 households. Then the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, was leaving office, and he decided to regularize all the people that had registered in this registry. Basically, what they had to do is to register online to request the Permiso Especial de Permanencia, and it had some conditions. They needed to have a document showing that they had a Venezuelan citizenship. They could not have criminal records and other things. They had from August to December to register, and about 64% of the people registered in the program. And the benefits of the program are many. I just am going to concentrate on three that are important. The first one is that it provided legal migratory status for a short period of time, and this is very related to what Betilde is saying. It was a transitory program. It provided working permit. All the people that were in the PEPRAM could work, and it provided access to health, education, and early childhood. And very importantly, it became an identification document for migrants to request bank accounts and other services. So what we want to do is to understand what were the benefits of this program for the migrants themselves. And I'm not going to go into the details of the empirical strategy, but I would like to tell you is what we wanted to do with the empirical strategy that we designed. Basically, what we wanted was we carefully designed the empirical strategy to compare irregular migrants that were similar enough to the group of beneficiary migrants. And we did many things, but therefore we included in the sample irregular migrants that moved to Colombia in the same time span as the ones that were benefit from the PEP-RAM. And we controlled for several characteristics of the migrants before migration and use econometric techniques to ensure that these two groups are the more similar as possible on observable variables, but on unobservable as well. So we did a large survey. It was very difficult because when we were going to go on the field, the pandemic started and we had to move to doing the surveys by phone. We were supported by several Venezuelan organizations. I see here that Juan Beloria is here. Coalición por Venezuela played a large role helping us to roll out the survey. For the treatment group, we have the PEPRAM. We had the contact information of all the people that register in the PEPRAM. We surveyed people that registered and did not register in PEP. We surveyed people that register in RAM and register in PEP. And we recontact them using the cell phones. We have a sample of about 1,700 households. For the irregular migrants, which was quite a really large challenge, what we did is that we randomly selected irregular migrants from referrals that were provided by the treatment and the control group, but also from list of 13 organizations of migrants that very generously provided their list such that we could extract that information and recontact the migrants. It was about 1,500 households that we surveyed. And as I say, this is where the migrant organizations were very fundamental to doing. The sample is mostly in Bogotá, Medellin, and Barranquilla, but we have migrants all over in very other municipalities of Colombia. And I'm just going to show you some brief results. The first one and the first message that I want to convey is that the PEP really improves the welfare of migrants. And the improvement is quite large. So here I'm already showing the results of the econometric estimations. And here what you have is the per capita aggregate expenditure of the household. So what you see is that irregular migrants have 3.8 million aggregate expenditure per capita. whereas for the migrants that were similar to those irregular, the aggregate expenditure increased significantly. And what is very interesting with this is that it did not only improve the economic or the aggregate expenditure in economic terms and welfare in economic terms, but other dimensions of welfare that are related to what Lala was referring to earlier. The second thing that we look at is food security. And what we find is that food security increases, but it's still the levels of food insecurity are very high. So this is food security before the pandemic started. And when you see is that the PEP beneficiaries had a better food security than the irregular migrants. The difference is about 8 percentage points. After the pandemic started, of course, food insecurity increased significantly. But what we find is that even though the pandemic was very difficult for all migrants, PEP somehow played a protective role, and the benefits of PEP did not disappear due to the pandemic. And what you see again here is that food security is higher for migrants. Then what we do is that we try to look at other dimensions of welfare. And here what we have is a welfare index based on dimensions of health. And what we see here is that definitely the effect is huge. It's quite large. So in this index, what you see is that PEP migrants perceive that their health status is much better than those that are irregular. And here is what I'm referring to that is related to what Lala was mentioning. One part that is driving this difference in this index is the anxiety and depression. This is the percentage of people in the sample that said that they were anxious or depressed, extremely anxious or depressed. And what you see is that this is lower, more than half than for undocumented migrants. And then to finish, I'm just here another important message is that PEP was very important to improve labor formalization, but more importantly so to improve labor conditions, which is something that Betilde was mentioning. And I bring all what we have for labor markets, but what you see is that hourly wages increase, and they increase is significant. And this is not only because they work on formal jobs in a larger percentage, but because they were more empowered, it seems, to negotiate salaries and to have better conditions at work. Of course, their monthly income increases. And what is important, formalization increases in 10 percentage points. Not as much as we would have expected, because all of them can work on the formal market, but it's increasing, and this is something that we need to look at. Lastly, job satisfaction is a little bit higher for people that were benefited by PEP. So what I would like to finish with is that the regularization programs improve the economic and social condition of migrants in a significant way. And here I'm repeating what Betilde was saying is, it is important for migrants, but it's important for governments as well in two respects. One is that the government is better able to locate migrants, to better plan the assistance to the migrant population, but also to the local population that might be negatively affected in the short term and live together with the migrant population. But what I believe is the most important part is that in the long term, regularization contributes to maximize the positive impacts of migration on economic development on the destination countries. And with that, I finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ana Maria, for a very interesting presentation, and we will talk about it more during the discussion. So now we'll give the floor to Dani Bahar. Dani?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for those great, it's hard to follow up on all those great presentations, but I'll give it a try. So I think my internet is not great, so I don't know, if you're not hearing me, just move your hands or something so that I'll know. I'll speak slow and I'll keep it short just because of that. So I think I'm going to speak more in general from the economics perspective, maybe following up on the excellent, magnificent study of Ana Maria and her co-authors. And let me start by saying again what David said at the beginning, which I think it's important to let this sink in. This is the largest migration and refugee crisis in the history of the hemisphere. And as of today, is the second largest migration and refugee crisis in modern history. Definitely, I mean, in the last decades, since World War II. And, we need to let that sink in. This is not, it is like a massive, massive movement of people in a region. And I think Jose Hernandez, Jose Ignacio can speak to this, in a region that was not prepared to experience this movement of people. Ironically, the country in the region that was prepared and had a history of receiving immigrants was Venezuela for decades. And now the tables have turned, and all the other countries didn't really have the basic legislation to deal with this huge crisis. And comparing this, I'm not going to make a very thorough comparison with the Syrian crisis because different contexts, different regions, it's really comparing apples to elephants, not even apples to oranges. But there are a few things that I think are worth mentioning on the differences that we see. The first one, this is also something that it's very moving, but it's also it's a reality. Despite all the issues that we've been hearing from the great presentations from Lala and Betika and all the hurdles we see, I think it is. In the big scheme of things, I think it's important to see that the countries in the region are at least trying to some extent to are willing to deal with the proper policies to really benefit from this opportunity. Differently, and I'm saying this in contrast to perhaps many European countries dealing with the Syrian refugee crisis, or even Turkey, or to some extent Jordan and Lebanon. So I think we see here an interesting phenomenon that it's going to go for research in the future on why Latin American countries have been at least willing, not perfectly, far from perfect, but at least willing to engage in a way that could convert this into an opportunity. And this is really important because they've been doing this on their own for the most part. And when I mean on their own, I'm talking in particular about the resources that are typically hugely important to deal with this massive crisis. And I think part of the reason I'm here today with you is because a study that we published a couple of years ago and that we updated earlier this year on the vast differences that when you compare the Venezuelan refugee crisis with others, you do see a huge disparity in the resources of the international community that are going to the countries in the region. And we did that calculation. It's online on the Brookings website. But just to give you the headline, is that when you look at all the money that has been committed in terms of aid and assistance from the international community to the countries in the region, and you compare that, for instance, to all the money that has been committed from international assistance to other crises, the Venezuelan refugee crisis is, as David said at the beginning, is on its way to be the largest refugee crisis in modern history, but it's also by far the most underfunded crisis in modern history. And the numbers are clear. When we look at resources per refugee, in the case of Syria, we see about more than $3,000 have gone per refugee from the international community, whereas in the case of Venezuela, the number is less than 300. So it's more than a 10-fold difference. And this is crucially important because despite all the difficulties, despite the fact that these countries in the region were not prepared for this massive flow. And despite that they're trying to do their best and they're doing a lot of mistakes, they're doing this essentially without any help from the international community. And this help is crucial. It's crucial, in the very short term for humanitarian reasons. I mean, there's people, as it was said before, people, the Venezuelan situation is complex. And if you look at any socioeconomic indicator of Venezuela today, you would think that you're talking about a country that is in civil war. By any means, any socioeconomic indicator you take from Venezuela, it's comparable to the worst performing countries in the world after having gone through some sort of conflict. So a lot of these refugees, if not most of them, are coming with huge humanitarian needs. They're coming undernourished. They need medical assistance. They need a place to stay, and these funds have to go first and foremost to help the humanitarian aspect. But it's not only that. It shouldn't stop there. And I'm for the past few years I've been calling on the fact that these resources are critical for labor integration. And I think that this follows up on Ana Maria's point, because and I'm going to talk about this in a couple of minutes. But the funding is not only for humanitarian needs; it's also to assure that these immigrants are integrating into their local economies, and as such, allowing them to reach their full potential. So let me just talk about that for a few minutes, and then I'll stop. And I want to say that the conditions for a proper integration of these Venezuelans into the local labor force are there, in the sense that if you look at the data, and I've looked in particular at data from Colombia, but I'm pretty certain that this applies to all the other countries. When you look at the Venezuelans that have arrived to Colombia, they are on average younger than the local labor force, and on average slightly more educated. So there is huge potential for them to integrate into the local labor forces in a way that could really bring important benefits. But many of these Venezuelans, as we know, and it has said before, they have an undocumented status. They don't have a quote unquote legal status in the country. And the first step, and I think that what Ana Maria just showed is, it makes it pretty obvious to all of us. The first step is to provide them with papers so that they will be able to join the labor force. And Ana Maria has shown that this, has important benefits to the migrants themselves. And, here, of course, we mentioned, Betica mentioned Colombia, who just passed a project to give an amnesty to 1.8 million Venezuelans, out of which 1 million are undocumented, for a 10-year status. And Betica also mentioned Costa Rica, and there are other less generous, but there are other measures being taken in the region. But it's not only there. It's not only that. I mean, providing the legal status, providing documents, it's hugely important. It's a binding constraint, but it has to go beyond that, because finding a job is hard. It's hard for all of us, right? I mean, you need to know people. You need to maybe have the time to look for a better match. And, many of us, I can speak for myself, I think, but maybe many of us, are privileged and have the time to wait, and perhaps have some resources to make it happen. For refugees, it's even harder. So this is important. I just have a couple of minutes and to finish, and I'm going to say something else. The reason that this, beyond giving the status, the reason that the funding is crucially important, it's because whenever you have such an inflow of people into an economy, there's a lot of fear that, maybe if they all get jobs, salaries are going to go down, unemployment is going to increase. And in a paper joined with Ana Maria and Sandra Rosso, who's one of the best Colombian economists, both are some of the best Colombian economists, we together shown that in the first round of amnesties, the one that Ana Maria was talking, there was zero effects on the local labor market. So there's really no big evidence to fear that providing access to the labor markets is gonna result in negative effects. But I want to go back to the point I made about funding, and with this I'll stop. The importance of funding is not only about humanitarian assistance, it's about labor market integration. Because the only way that firms, the private sector, will be able to integrate and to bring on Venezuelans and Colombians, or Venezuelans and Chileans, or Venezuelans and Argentinians, or Venezuelans and Bolivians, and Ecuadorians, is going to be through the private sector and through the expansion of the private sector. So it's important that a lot of this funding will also go to infrastructure. It will go to credits to small firms and medium firms that can expand, that can hire people. Because in our countries, in the Latin American countries, these are things that are, regardless of the migration, are already lagging behind. So when we think about funding, it's not only about humanitarian, it's also crucial for labor market integrations. I'll stop here. I was told by somebody that I look like a lawyer, that I said I'm going to speak shortly, and I spoke for so
thank you. Thank you, Annie, for your presentation. And talking about lawyers, now we're going to have one speaking. It's Dr. Jose Ignacio Hernandez, fellow at the Growth Lab and professor at the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, my alma mater, by the way, at Caracas, Venezuela. So, Jose Ignacio, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. It's a pleasure again to be here. And after these wonderful presentations, I'm going to summarize how humanitarian law can facilitate the global management of the Venezuelan humanitarian displaced crisis. There are three main problems regarding the Venezuelan massive displaced crisis. The first one is how to assure humanitarian standards of protection, including, and I would say particularly, the non-refoulement right. That is, as we all know, a problem that has been present, for instance, in Trinidad and Tobago with several problems there. The second is how to promote an orderly and secure migration as a favorable condition for economic growth. And finally, how to coordinate multilateral policies, particularly in financings, as Danny explained. And the main problem that we have from an institutional perspective or from a legal perspective is that the international law does not provide a clear framework to address a unique crisis like the Venezuela. Because there are too many concepts. We have the concept of migrants that is basically based on labor permits, residence. We then have the traditional concept, of refugee, according to the 1951 convention that is based on particular cases of persecution. Then we have, in the Inter-American System of Human Rights, the 1948 Cartagena Declaration that expanded the refugee to cover cases of political, economic, and social crisis. Then we also have the refugee prima facie, which is basically temporary protection for refugee in massive crisis. And finally, according to the 2016 New York Declaration and the 2018 Global Pact, we have this idea of global mobilizations. In any case, uncommon problems require uncommon solutions. And this is the example of the decree number 216 enacted by the Government of Colombia. This is a pragmatical approach, an uncommon solution, but in my opinion, solve most of the problems that I referred. First, the decree recognizes human rights standards of protections based on international humanitarian law, and this is very important. The decree framed the Venezuelan situation as a humanitarian crisis. However, the decree does not declare the refugee status, not even prima facie, but this is not relevant because at the end, from a pragmatical approach, the decree recognizes the humanitarian standards of protections that are usually related to the refugee status. Particularly, the decree allows residents' rights that could promote an orderly and secure migration as a favorable condition for economic growth, but, however, only regarding Venezuelan displaced in Colombia as of January 31, 2021. But there are some problems that the decree does not solve. First of all, the decree is a unilateral decision, but the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela should be addressed from a multilateral approach, basically to aim three objectives. First, coordinate international financing, and this is something that I have been discussing deeply with Danny and David. Second, coordinate policies aimed to address the complex humanitarian emergency, because the Venezuelan displacement is a flaw. Eventually, the capacity of the host state, in this case, Colombia, may collapse if the humanitarian crisis is not solved. And Lala explains very well this situation of the pendular movement. So because we are talking about a flow of migrants and not only a stock, it is necessary to solve the main cause of the migration crisis in Venezuela, which is the complex humanitarian emergency. This is why, in my opinion, the Venezuelan crisis should be framed as a humanitarian displaced crisis caused by the complex humanitarian emergency in Venezuela and the collapse of the state, and only a multilateral approach based on international human rights can solve the main three problems that I refer. First, recognizing human rights standard of protection of migrants, particularly in all the region. Second, promote an orderly and secure migration as a favorable condition for economic growth, as was explained very well by Ana Maria Ibanez. And finally, promote multilateral cooperation to solve the complex humanitarian emergency and the humanitarian displaced crisis, particularly regarding with the finance problem. And now we have another issue here that is should be mentioned, that as we all know, Latin America is facing, according to the recent macroeconomic report of the Inter-American Development Bank, the biggest recession since independence, and therefore Latin American countries are facing several problems in terms of fiscal space. So in order to fulfill with humanitarian standards to protect Venezuelan displaced people, it is necessary to expand the public expense. And for that purpose, it is necessary to find a comprehensive financial solution. Otherwise, the Venezuelan crisis will become a regional one with impact in all the hemisphere. And just to finalize, I want to recall a basic statement of the 2016 New York Declaration that I think summarized the new trends regarding migration, refugee, and mobilizations. Large movement of refugees and migrants have political, economic, social, developmental, humanitarian, and human rights ramifications, which cross all borders. These are global phenomena that call for global approach and global solutions. No one state can manage such movement on its own. Not Colombia cannot manage the Venezuelan crisis on its own, and only a global solution based on a regional approach, and we have the support of the Organization of American States for that purpose, will solve in a comprehensive way the Venezuelan migrations and refugee crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, José Ignacio. So with that presentation, we are going to start the discussion. We have approximately 26 minutes. So if you want to make questions, please share with us on the chat. I know that some of you has already done some questions, and I would like first, before going to the questions from the audience, start the discussion with some comments and also questions after listening to all of you. There were great presentations, and you presented different sensitive and relevant topics for Venezuelan migrants and refugees. We have been talking here about the importance of their documentation and being regularized, the lack of funds, the pendular migration that Lala explained at the beginning, the challenges that the region has with discrimination and xenophobia, that unfortunately we have seen more and more xenophobia against some Venezuelans. So, Ana Maria, I was looking at your slides on the welfare that have been improved for Venezuelan migrants and refugees, specifically when they have gotten PEP in Colombia, and something similar also happened in Peru with the PTP, Permiso Temporal de Permanencia. So in what sense do you think el Estatuto Temporal de Protección for Venezuelans in Colombia would impact the economy of Colombia, and also how the US, for example, could be benefited for Venezuelans taking the TPS? Because one of the things that we always think when the TPS or Estatuto Temporal de Protección in Colombia are announced is that all Venezuelans are the ones who are getting the benefit. They're the ones who are getting the documentation that they're regular. But also this could be a great benefit for the receiving countries in the long term. So that'll be great if you can speak a little bit about it after what you showed on the PEP.
Thank you, David. Yes, when we were doing this study, we never imagined that Colombia was going to do the Estatuto Temporal de Protección. And what our study shows right now is that definitely the PEP really created benefits for the Venezuelan migrants. However, and I did not discuss that because I didn't have enough time, we also find a lot of obstacles for that benefits to be completely full. No, there are a lot of obstacles and red tape procedures that do not allow the migrants to get really enter formal labor markets or create firms. And so if Colombia wants to reap off the benefits, the long-term benefits, it really needs to go into the nitty-gritty details that are also important as well. I mean, the decree it's good, it's important, but the details, the devil sometimes is in the details, and that is important. That's the first thing that I wanted to say. The second thing that's important from the Estatuto Temporal de Protección is that PEP is only for 2 years, so migrants really have to renew it each 2 years. And in economic terms, that's not good. You don't have enough certainty. You're not going to invest as much as you would have if you have a longer temporal timeline. So by providing them 10 years and telling them, look, this is a first step so you can become citizens or you can have a permanent visa, it gives them a timeline to really make decisions in the long term. Having said that, of course, this is going to imply a lot of work from the government of Colombia and a lot of investments. So what I believe is important is, as I said in the presentation, that now the government knows where the migrants are located, and that is important not only for purposes of the migrant and invest on the migrants, but invest on the local populations that are receiving those migrants and may be experiencing short-term costs in order for them to really have the long-term benefits of younger people, more educated people going into the labor force and willing to invest in the country and to be part of the Colombian society. So this is the first step. It's my last message. You really need to get that with a lot of other things that need to be done for the local population and to really improve the implementation of these programs.
Thanks, Ana Maria. Before going to questions and comments from the audience, Danny, you were saying that it's a huge step in the documentation for Venezuelan migrants and refugees, but of course, there's more to be done, and specifically the integration of labor markets. So what's your advice? You can give advice to a president in the region that's saying, okay, you are implementing the PEP, the Estatuto Temporal de Protección in Colombia, or now the CPP in Peru, or actually a Cartagena Declaration has been implemented in Brazil. But after that, how you could do better to integrate Venezuelans migrants and refugees on the labor markets. And also would like to ask you, and I know you have spoken this many times, but it's important to raise awareness, why the Syrian refugee crisis has been able to raise more funds, or even other crises such as the South Sudanese refugee crisis that have not the same refugees as Venezuela, but even though they have been able to raise more funds than the Venezuelan refugee crisis. And this is very important because there is an international solidarity conference to address the Venezuelan migration refugee crisis on June 17th, which Canada is leading this important effort. It is the third conference. And now with COVID-19, we are expecting to have more pledges from the countries, but we will see what happens. Thanks.
Good questions. It's hard. I'm going to try to answer very quickly just because of time. But you know, I remain with the point I was trying to make, maybe fast at the end, that I think that despite, you know, on top of all the regularization efforts and providing with the legal paperwork for people to work and to create firms and all of those things that are not perfect, but you know, we have to continue to push. It's crucially important to invest and to find the funding and the world to give the funding to these countries to invest in local infrastructure, to invest in credits for small and medium firms to be able to expand and hire these workers. And, you know, Colombia, again, we're talking about Colombia. I talk about Colombia a lot because it's the country that I've gotten more data from. And Colombia had a great program of giving $200 million of credit lines to firms in the regions where most Venezuelans have arrived. And I think that this is a great example. First of all, it's economics 101, right? If you have a huge inflow of people, you also want to compensate that with a huge inflow of capital, so that at the end, there's no negative effects whatsoever. On the contrary, there's positive effects, which you only get if you bring complementary resources such as capital. So that would be, I think, the basic thing. The other thing I want to say, because we're at Harvard Growth Lab, and this is the best place to say this, is that, you know, this is a blessing. I mean, despite all the terrible things that are happening to Venezuela, this Venezuelan refugee crisis is going to be the key to the reconstruction of Venezuela. Because the more these people integrate, the best they perform, the more technologies and knowledge and experience and management they get from many different industries around the continent, the more they excel, the more they're going to bring back that knowledge and that technology back to Venezuela after when it's time to reconstruct the country. And that's going to be the key to the diversification of the country, to, you know, a strong economy that grows for everybody. Last, on your question on why is it that, you know, Venezuelans are not getting as much funding, you know, I'm not a political scientist, but sorry about this. But the point I want to make is that, you know, there's one big difference, that on one end of the spectrum of the receiving countries in the Syrian crisis, you have rich countries. In Latin American, you know, in the case of the Venezuelan refugee crisis, you don't have rich countries on the end, on the receiving end. You have countries that are middle income or poor or middle income or and so on. So they don't have the resources, and there's no pressure from, let's say, what happens in Syria. I think a lot of European countries are giving a lot of money to Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon so that they will keep, and I forget the right word, but that they will keep the refugee crisis within those limits. You know, now, yesterday or this week was announced also like a huge, this is sensitive, but a huge package of, I think, $4 billion from USAID to deal with the Northern Triangle refugee crisis. Well, that's maybe another example. Those numbers are much, much, much higher than what you've seen in the region. So that's kind of the geopolitics of it.
If I may add very quickly on the excellent points that Danny just made, David, on why, you know, the issue of lack of funding is aligned to the last point he was making. There's also this conception that this is a sub-regional crisis. You know, the migration, the Venezuelan migrant and refugee crisis is something that pertains to the South American countries. So sort of this conception that is sub-regional. And if push comes to shove, well, it's a regional crisis where that the Western Hemisphere has to take care of together. And if there's a leader to be looked at, is the US the one to be providing the support. And I think this is a conversation that we need to keep having, and we need to, push this message that is not sub-regional, that is not regional. This is a global crisis, especially as you were saying, David, if we compare the numbers with the Syrian crisis. So, the point of this, the perceptions, the geopolitical understanding of the crisis is something that in my view at least, helps explain the lack of funding.
Thanks, Betilde, and I think that's crucial what you said, because it's a huge mistake, and I have been saying that on my role that I have in the OES, that to see this crisis as a sub-regional or regional. I mean, the fourth and fifth largest Venezuelan communities are not specifically in South America. We have it in the US and Spain. And having said that, it has been difficult to put this crisis on a global context. So hopefully this conference that will be held in June will help to address this in a more global way. It has joined us in this seminar, and it's a real honor to present him, Professor Hausman, who has raised his hand. And thank you, Professor, for also providing your support at the Harvard Growth Lab to have this seminar. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for organizing this excellent event. I learned a lot. I wanted to ask 4 quick questions. The first one is we have this very interesting result that providing a legal status to Venezuelans has had positive effects on Venezuelans, and I can imagine that a Colombian would want to know, have those positive effects on Venezuelans come at a cost to Colombians, or is this sort of like a win-win? And I wonder if there are studies that have looked at the impact on Colombians of the Venezuelan migration or the provision of legal status to Venezuelan migrants. The second point I wanted to make is that we see a differential in where the high-skilled Venezuelans go. And those have to do not so much with legal status as they have to do with professional accreditation. And I wonder if there has been thought given to the issue of the recognition of professional accreditation of Venezuelans. We know, for example, anecdotally, that Venezuelan medical doctors tend to go to Chile and to Spain because there's a path to professional accreditation in those countries. But we don't hear about Venezuelan doctors, say, in other parts of the continent. We've lost an immense amount of university professors. I don't know if that they are teaching at universities or they've had to do other things. So that the benefits of that or the contributions that the Venezuelan exiles could provide have something to do with professional accreditation. Is that an issue that is being reconsidered? Third question for Jose Ignacio. Jose Ignacio said essentially that these are the things that need to happen to address or to solve the Venezuelan crisis. So the obvious question is, so what happens if they're not addressed? That is, what is the, what you might want to call the passive scenario? What happens if nothing is done? And the final question I would ask is, we've seen the pictures of Venezuelans walking from the border further on. We've seen. We know that there is this páramo, there's this mountain between Cúcuta and Bucaramanga that is...
Páramo de Berlín.
Yeah, where many people die of hypothermia and so on, walking. That seems to be like a lose-lose for everybody. That, it doesn't seem, I mean, it's one thing to provide housing, to provide food, to provide medical care, but it seems to me that to provide transportation doesn't seem to be like the most complex task possible, and it seems to be causing an enormous amount of suffering. Have there been actions to solve just the mobility problem of the Venezuelan migrants so that they can reach their points of destination, maybe where they have friends and families, with less pain? And those.
Thank you, Professor. Well, I don't know who wants to take the first and second question that Professor Hausman has just made. La Maria. Okay.
I just answered one on the chat, so not to take time. I just pushed the study that Ana Maria, Sandra, Rosa, and me did, precisely answering the question that Ricardo just asked. I just put it on the chat.
Okay.
Yes, I was going to talk about that study, and I just want to mention something very important about that study. What we find is that there is no impact of PEP on formal workers, but what is very important is that these people were working on the informal markets where the more vulnerable people are, and now they can move to the formal markets. So it's going to release pressure on the informal labor markets. And very quickly about the professional accreditation, that's one of the obstacles that we are finding with PEP. You have engineers that now can work in the formal labor market, but as works that are there is a lot of high skill downgrading, no? Skill downgrading for these migrants. And those are the obstacles that need to be tackled for really the regularization programs to be able to provide the benefits that can provide for the countries.
Thanks, Ana Maria. Jose Ignacio, about the third question.
Well, that's a very good question. What happens if nothing happens? Well, the humanitarian emergency in Venezuela will expand on the region in a sort of spillover effect of these informal institutions that we already are seeing, as Lala explained, in terms of criminal organizations. And this is why, as was already discussed, the Venezuelan crisis should be addressed, should be analyzed, should be explained as a humanitarian crisis. Migration crisis or humanitarian one, and the advantage to frame the Venezuelan crisis as a humanitarian one is that we will have the proper institutional arrangement to promote multilateral cooperation. Otherwise, again, the humanitarian emergency in Venezuela will extend on the region, and we will start seeing humanitarian emergencies in Colombia, humanitarian emergencies in Brazil, at the same time when the region, Latin America, is facing the worst economic recessions since independence due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this could be a real problem for the region.
Thanks, Jose Ignacio. And also, the other question, Professor Hausman, did, maybe Lala, you've been on the field, the lack of transportation sometimes when we see so many Venezuelans walking. I just want to just put in perspective. Venezuelans walk from Cucuta, which is the city border to Venezuela, not only to other cities in Colombia. They have walked even to Lima in Peru, or even they have walked to Chile, to Santiago, to northern Chile. So just to put in perspective, to walk from Cucuta to Lima is the same that you walk now from Boston to Salt Lake City in Utah. That's the desperation that Venezuelans have to find a place to eat, or a place to sleep, or find a safe. So they are walking from the east coast of the US to the west coast, the similar distance. So just want to put that in perspective. So what can be done there, Lala? Thanks.
Yes, of course. Thank you, David. I think that just wrapping up a little bit about the funding, of course, that Danny was saying at the beginning, and then Jose, and of course, Professor Hausman just intervening with this question, and Betica just wrapping around, is that we need to stop doing this diagnosis about the situation. We have been doing a diagnosis for 7 years. This is a crisis, humanitarian crisis, and need to be addressed. And in June, well, I think that we need to address this. It's a humanitarian crisis, but as Danny said, it needs to be addressed in a mid and long-term intervention. We need to stop giving shoes to these people to walk more comfortably. We need to receive them. As I was saying at the beginning, we need to have a plan to receive these people. So, and for the walking through this 100 kilometers, I think it's and we have been in the field last week, and we think that they're not walking, they are roaming around. It's like a zombie motivation. Most of them, they don't have a place to go. They don't have, it's like a traveling path. No, they're not traveling. They're not walking to a place. Most of them are roaming around, and they will stop wherever they found a place to stop. And I think this needs to stop. And the worst part, and I think that one of our best part here in these spaces is to tell you that the roaming right now, it's almost 60 or 70% children are the ones who are roaming around of Colombia. Children, and when we talk about children, 15 years old or younger. So we need to start addressing this as a region, but as David says, it's not a Colombian issue, because they are, as I said, and I repeat, they are roaming around the region, and they go back and forth 600 kilometers, 800 kilometers, and they don't know where they're gonna be. And I think that we need to start working with the government of Colombia, giving them the tools how to speak to these people, how to talk, how to inform, because they are not informed, and they don't believe and they don't trust the institution. So they start like going like zombies around. And children, I think, is the worst part, because those are the victims of the trafficking, of all the violent groups, which are growing in the whole region again.
Thanks, Lala. I'll give, because we have a few minutes left, some questions from the audience. One here could be good for Betilde. It's made by Luisa Palacio. What is missing for the multilateral approach to the Venezuelan refugee crisis that the speakers are proposing? And also she said that can the adoption of these good practices explained by Ana Maria and Danny by Latin American countries be associated to access to financing from multilaterals? I think Betilde could be.
Very quickly, some points on that, and what Lala just said really resonated. She says, we don't need any more diagnosis, we need a plan. And not that there are not good things happening. There's no preparations and responses that are well thought out on the part of receiving countries. I'm not saying that there isn't, but maybe perhaps what is lacking is a more assertive presentation of plans. And you know, remember, David, when we were preparing this talk, you told me to refer maybe to the work that the OAS is doing in Central America. We have a regional cooperation process called MIRPS, that's the acronym in Spanish, which is really the regional application of the comprehensive refugee protection framework that is contained in the Global Compact on Refugees. And one very concrete thing that we've been trying to push along with UNHCR, both institutions are technical secretariat to the process, is developing standardized quantification process exercises, where we, in a unified manner, the 7 countries that participate in this regional cooperation process that are either countries of origin, countries of transit, or countries of destination, as well as countries of return, because you know there's a lot of voluntary and involuntary return of migrants. Really plan out the cost of the response, and also quantifying what they are also providing in kind, and very, very specifically specifying what is needed. So, you know, just to think a little bit outside of the Venezuelan crisis, to look at other crises that you also referred to, David, the Northern Triangle displacement crisis, could be ways to inform this call that Lala makes in terms of exhaustion from diagnostic exercises and really thinking of plan and concrete actions.
Thanks, Betilde. Well, I think in respect of the time, it's 11:30. I would like to thank everyone, Lala, Betilde, Ana Maria, Dani, and of course, Jose Ignacio for making this seminar possible. I think it was a great discussion, and thanks to everyone who connected and participated on this discussion. I just want to end to add something on an end note. And Dani said, I mean, when you see what happens in Venezuela, you think, oh, this is a civil war. And one of the biggest lessons that we need to have is that when you lose democracy and freedom, you can have a consequence similar to war, and that's what happened in Venezuela. So at the end of the day, to stop this migration outflow goes also with the change inside Venezuela that has to go for a democracy and rule of law and a country with opportunity. If that doesn't change soon, we'll have another conference next year, and we will be talking not of 5.5 million, but 7 million. And 2 years, it will be 9 million. So, and as all the panelists said, it's very important, not only the diagnosis, because we have a lot, but all the plan and the regional consensus to attend and protect Venezuelan migrants and refugees, because they're going to be vital, not only for those receiving countries, but they're going to be vital for the rebuilding of Venezuela. So to all of you, thank you so much for your presentations and from the audience for participation. Have a great week. Thanks. Take care.